Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're putting on our sociologist hats to dissect what is, quite frankly, a massive global anomaly. Across the developed world, birth rates are absolutely plummeting. And for years, the exact cause has been this highly debated puzzle. But recent data points to a culprit that isn't, a government policy or a war or even a macroeconomic collapse. It's actually a device that most of us are probably keeping within arm's reach right this second. We're going to look at the fascinating intersection of human reproduction and technological adoption, specifically focusing on how the smartphone entirely shifted how we interact as humans. Okay, let's dive into this because this number is just staggering. According to a major study examining this whole phenomenon, the release of the very first Apple smartphone explains up to 52% of the total drop in fertility among women in the United States aged 15 to 44. Just think about that for a second. Up to half of the decline in births for a massive demographic group can literally be traced back to the introduction of a single piece of consumer technology. Section 1. The demographic mystery, a 22% drop since 2007. To really understand how researchers arrived at this bold conclusion, we first need to look at the broader demographic mystery that had completely baffled economists and sociologists alike. Since 2007, which, not coincidentally, is the exact year the first iPhone launched, the overall fertility rate in the US has dropped by a massive 22%. It's a sheer cliff dive on the demographic charts. Now, human behavior on a macro scale rarely shifts this dramatically overnight without some clear catastrophic trigger. So naturally, researchers started looking for the usual suspects to explain this timeline.
The immediate assumption was, well, the 2008 financial crisis. It makes sense, right? People have less money, so they have fewer children. But economists Caitlin Myers and Ezekiel Hooper from the National Bureau of Economic Research realized that these traditional economic factors simply couldn't fully explain a massive 22% drop over such a sustained period. They analyzed income fluctuations, shifts in education levels, and even skyrocketing housing costs. And while those definitely play a role, none of these ruled-out suspects perfectly matched the timeline and the specific geography of the disappearing birth rates. The data was clearly pointing somewhere else.
Section 2. The AT&T experiment. Isolating the iPhone. So, how in the world do you actually prove a piece of technology caused a shift in human reproduction? Well, you need an experiment. And researchers found a brilliant, real-world scientific setup right in front of them. They utilized an unintended natural experiment created by Apple itself. When the iPhone launched in June 2007, Apple signed an exclusive contract with the telecom provider AT&T. This exclusivity window lasted all the way until February 2011. And because AT&T's network coverage wasn't universal across the entire United States, there were large swaths of the country that physically could not get the iPhone, while others had immediate access. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how perfectly this maps to the scientific method. The counties dominated by AT&T effectively became the experimental group. They had the iPhone. The counties dominated by Verizon and Sprint became the control group. They did not have the iPhone. By comparing the birth rates between these specific regions during that exact exclusivity window, researchers were able to prove actual causation, not just correlation. They could see exactly what happened to birth rates in areas where the smartphone infiltrated society versus areas where it hadn't yet arrived.
And just to be absolutely sure this wasn't some weird geographical coincidence, the researchers ran rigorous placebo tests. They mathematically tested fictional launch dates prior to 2007, and they tested competitor coverage networks. The result? Absolutely no birth rate gap whatsoever. The geographical discrepancy in dropping fertility aligned absolutely perfectly with the precise rollout of AT&T's network and the adoption of the iPhone.
Section 3. A generational divide. Who stopped having kids? And this brilliantly illustrates that the drop wasn't distributed equally. To really grasp the sociological impact, we have to shift our focus to the specific demographic groups most impacted by this tech shift. Breaking the data down by age groups within those AT&T experimental zones shows an incredibly stark contrast. Adolescents aged 15 to 19 saw a drastic 4.5 to 8% drop in birth rates. Young adults aged 20 to 24 saw a drop of up to 6.6%. Meanwhile, the older cohorts saw a much more modest effect, closer to just a 2% decline. So the data clearly shows that the youngest cohorts concentrate the core of this demographic decline. This wasn't just some broad economic pessimism stopping older couples from having their second or third child. No, this was fundamentally a generational behavioral shift driven by early smartphone adoption. The people whose formative dating and socializing years were instantly hijacked by the smartphone changed their behaviors the absolute most. Section 4. Redefining social habits, how screens stop births. This brings us to the core of our sociological analysis. What are the actual behavioral mechanisms behind these numbers? Like, how exactly does a glowing screen prevent a birth? Well, researchers identified 3 specific ways the smartphone entirely rewired human social and sexual behavior, particularly inside teenagers' bedrooms. Step 1, virtual exchanges rapidly replaced physical meetups. Texting and social media meant you just didn't have to leave the house to feel connected. And without physical proximity, sexual frequency inherently plummets. Step 2, the smartphone provided completely private, unlimited access to pornography, which researchers note dramatically reduced the biological and social desire to actually go out and seek a physical partner. And step 3, for those who were sexually active, the internet on their phone provided instant, private access to information regarding contraception and abortion. Time use surveys heavily confirm this massive shift. The hours previously spent hanging out in malls, going to parties, or cruising around in cars were completely replaced by isolated screen time. As the researchers note, addiction to screens acts on social and sexual behaviors themselves. The primary mechanism isn't necessarily that the phone made people want fewer children, it's that the phone radically reduced the physical human interaction that actually leads to having children in the first place. So, the crucial point is the massive policy paradox we are seeing today. Across the globe, panicking governments are trying to fix their falling birth rates by throwing money at the problem, offering cash bonuses, tax breaks, financial incentives to have kids. But they are completely missing the target. While raising a child is undeniably expensive, these financial policies are pulling the wrong lever. A government check does absolutely nothing to cure the sociological reality of screen disconnection. You cannot pay people to fall in love if they aren't even looking up from their phones to meet each other. Section 5. The global tech shock, a worldwide phenomenon. Let's zoom out a bit and see how this builds, because moving away from just the United States reveals that this individual, bedroom-level behavior scales up to a startling macro-level trend. This isn't just an American phenomenon, not at all. A parallel, wide-reaching study analyzed the demographic data of 128 different countries. They tracked the precise moment massive connected smartphone adoption hit each specific nation's population. And the pattern is undeniably consistent. In country after country, birth rates definitively curve downward exactly 2 to 3 years after peak smartphone adoption is reached. This trend is entirely independent of local cultures, religious backgrounds, or even variations in national healthcare systems. Whether you look at Europe, Asia, or the Americas, the timing is almost universally identical once the technology is introduced. The researchers' profound conclusion is that we are living through, quote, a planetary-scale technological shock. It's a macroeconomic and sociological phenomenon that has fundamentally changed human reproduction. The very device designed to connect us to the entire world has, in a very measurable way, disconnected us from the physical intimacy required to sustain our own populations. Which leaves us with this final, lingering thought. The data is absolutely clear. The smartphone has undeniably altered the trajectory of human demographics. But as we look at the dropping birth rates in the increasingly isolated younger generations, we really have to ask ourselves, what happens to the future of a society when our connection to a screen supersedes our physical connection to each other? It's a massive question, not just for sociologists, but for every single one of us holding a device right now. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I hope this gives you a whole new perspective the next time you unlock your screen.